I dye my hair was red when I was a kid, and I dye it red all the time, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, no, and then I dye it back. I cut bangs, and I'm like, ah! I cannot handle bangs. I have a blockhead. It's like, okay, so here's where we're going to start. We are going to start with talking about how carbon dioxide is carried around in the bloodstream, because we already did oxygen, right? We know how oxygen is carried in the bloodstream, so now all we have to do is talk about how carbon dioxide is carried in the bloodstream. So stick with me. This is going to seem kind of hard, but if you stick with me and you stay awake and you slap yourself when you're falling asleep, Boris, you slap yourself when he does work all night, but I still get to pick on him. If you slap yourself when you're falling asleep, then you'll get this. So here's the deal. You've seen this equation before. Yes? Yeah. Right? Part of the reason I taught it to you at the beginning of the semester is so you wouldn't flip me off today when I make you really try to understand it. Okay, so here's the deal. There are 3 different ways that carbon dioxide travels in the bloodstream. First way, travels as carbon dioxide in the blood plasma. With me? Okay. Only 7% of the carbon dioxide travels in the blood plasma as carbon dioxide. Okay? Now, another 23% travels, okay, not in the blood plasma, but move inside the red blood cells and travel on the globin portion of hemoglobin, right? Okay, does that outcompete oxygen? No, because it's not traveling in the same seat, okay? So now I've got 30% of the carbon dioxide traveling in the bloodstream by those 2 mechanisms. One last mechanism, and the other mechanism is force this to go this direction, right? The carbon dioxide traveling as carbon dioxide travel as bicarbonate ion, okay? But it causes a problem, of course, because when you do this, you dramatically impact the pH of the system. So there's a mechanism by which we can carry massive quantities of carbon dioxide, like from systemic capillaries, without massive impacts on the pH of the system. And I'm about to teach you that mechanism, okay? So here we go with these figures, okay? You're going to hate them at first, but then you'll get used to it, okay? Here we go. So we're going to look at this figure first, right? We're going to talk about what happens at systemic capillaries, and then we'll talk about what happens at pulmonary capillaries. So stick with me, okay? So at systemic capillaries, we know, of course, we are going to generate quite a bit of carbon dioxide because of metabolism, right? Cellular respiration or internal respiration generates the carbon dioxide. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to follow all of it and then carry it to the lungs, and then we're going to get rid of it, carbon dioxide. Good? Okay. So first, the carbon dioxide is, of course, generated as a byproduct of cellular respiration, and it moves from the tissue cells through the interstitial fluid into the blood plasma. 7% of it stays and rides around like that as carbon dioxide. Okay, got it? Now, next, 23% of it, stick with me, will go in and bind to the globin portion of hemoglobin, right? And it's just riding on the hemoglobin. Okay, got it? Okay. The rest of the 70%, you are going to manipulate it so that you can carry vast quantities of it with really minor changes in pH. So watch what we're going to do. We are going to take that carbon dioxide and we're going to combine it with water via the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. You remember that enzyme? We have boatloads of carbonic anhydrase inside red blood cells. Okay? Okay. And then what we're going to do is we are going to take that and make it into, what is that? Carbonic acid, right? And then we're going to take the carbonic acid, stick with me, this is where it gets confusing, and it's going to dissociate, right, to H plus and HCO3 minus. How can we carry around massive amounts of this without having massive impacts on the pH? Well, it only impacts the pH if I let the H plus go into solution. So what if I allow a negative amino acid on hemoglobin to temporarily hold on to that H plus? You guys with me? So I actually temporarily hold on to that H plus. If it stays bound to the negative amino acids on hemoglobin, does it impact the system very much? No, it doesn't. You with me? Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that HCO3 minus, right? I already took care of the H plus. I'm going to take that HCO3 minus and have a little bit extra impact on pH by pushing it out into the blood plasma to allow it to buffer whatever pH changes were going on out there. because HCO3 minus, actually the bicarbonate ion has a little bit of buffering capacity. Okay, you with me? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push it out, but if I push out massive amounts of bicarbonate ion, I can affect the electrochemical gradient of the red blood cell. So instead of just pushing it out by itself, I always exchange it for another negative ion. It's called the chloride shift, right? So what I'm going to do is every single time that I push HCO3 minus out, I use a carrier protein that has a binding site for bicarbonate and a binding site for chloride, and I swap them, right? Okay, so why the hell did I do all of this? Because I did all of this so that I can carry vast quantities of carbon dioxide with minor changes in pH. Why do I care about pH? Remember, the blood has to be 7.35 to 7.45, otherwise the shape of your protein starts to change. The shape of your clotting proteins, the shape of your globins, the shape of your hormones starts to change, right? So this is a massive problem if you can't carry carbon dioxide without massive impacts on the pH of the blood. You with me? So what I've just done is I've sort of protected myself from this major changes in the pH, and I've done it by sort of having the red blood cell be the intermediary, right? Okay, but here's a problem. I can't breathe out bicarbonate ion. It's not a gas, right? So now what I have to do is I have to go take that blood, right? And I'm carrying all this carbon dioxide in 3 different forms, and then I have to deliver that blood to the pulmonary capillaries. You guys with me? Okay, so I'm going to deliver it to the pulmonary capillaries. And what am I going to have to do? I'm going to have to reverse everything that I just did, right? Let's do the easy parts first. So when I deliver that blood to the pulmonary capillaries, obviously I want to breathe out the carbon dioxide, right? Okay, so let's get rid of the easiest carbon dioxide first. The easiest was, how much percent was dissolved in the blood plasma? 7. That's, you just diffuse that from the capillary into the alveolus, breathe it out. What do you think the next easiest one to get rid of is? The one that was bound to hemoglobin, right? Okay, it's just holding on to it at hemoglobin, on the globin portion of hemoglobin. Then I breathe out that percent. What was that? 23%. You got it? Okay. Now, what I'm going to have to do to get rid of the 70% is I'm going to have to reverse everything that I just did. So stick with me for a second. I need an H+. What was holding on to the H+ for me? Yeah, it was the hemoglobin holding on to the H+. So here we go. Hemoglobin lets go of the H+. But in order to reverse it, what else do I need? I need a bicarbonate ion. Where am I going to get it? Blood plasma. And I'm going to have to reverse the chloride shift. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm going to push the chloride back out, bring the bicarbonate ion back in. Okay. Now I've got those 2 components, right? When I have those 2 components right here, you see them? Okay. Then I can reverse this direction, and then I get carbonic acid. This is a reversible reaction. And as long as I have, carbonic anhydrase, as long as I have carbonic anhydrase, I can take that and I can split it back into water and carbon dioxide. So you see what we're going to do? We're going to actually split it back into water and carbon dioxide. What's going to happen to the water? Who the hell cares? It's water, right? Just do whatever water does. I don't know where you need it, right? And then what's going to happen to the carbon dioxide? I am going to move it out of the red blood cell into the interstitial fluid and then breathe it out. Whew, right? Thanks, red blood cells. You're working very hard and making me think, and I hate you. Okay, so you got it? So here, I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions to sort of reinforce it. Okay, so let's go through it, and this time you guys are going to think about it as we go through, and you're going to try to use the words. First off, figure A. Somebody in your words, explain to me why. Why you do all this? Why are you doing it? Without affecting your pH. Okay, got it? Okay, so now we'll just go through a little bit of it. How much of your carbon dioxide is carried inside the blood plasma as CO2? 7%. Okay. How much of your carbon dioxide moves inside the red blood cell and sits on the globin portion of hemoglobin? 23%. And now I need to carry the rest of it, 70%, right? And I need to carry massive amounts of that. I need to carry 70% of that without impacting the pH. So how am I going to do it? Okay. How I'm going to do it is I am going to force this reaction this direction. I've always got water, yes, okay? And inside the red blood cell, I have what relevant enzyme? Carbonic anhydrase, right? and then I am going to force this reaction this direction. Okay, so now I've got H+, right, and bicarbonate ion. If I let go of the H+, it's going to massively drop my pH. So instead of letting it go, what do I do with it? I hold on to it inside the red blood cell, right, on hemoglobin. Got it? Okay. Do you see that basically the red blood cell is sort of buffering what's happening here? And then what do I do with this? I swap it for chloride. I push it into where? Blood plasma, right? And it has some small buffering capacity for other H+ ions that it encounters there, right? Okay. So do you see what we did? All right, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to let you lead me through. So this happened in which set of capillary beds? In which set of capillary beds do I push it that direction? Systemic. Okay, now I'm going to pump it back to the heart and then back to pulmonary capillary beds. And at the pulmonary capillary beds, help me. So you guys work with me. Easiest carbon dioxide to get rid of is what, where? 7% in the plasma. Okay. Second easiest carbon dioxide to get rid of is what, where? 23% bound to hemoglobin as carbon dioxide, right? And then 70%, what you are going to have to do is to reverse all of it. So, get me H+. Where was the H+? It's bound to hemoglobin, right? I have to let go of it. Where was the HCO3-, the bicarbonate ion? Blood plasma. How do I get it? Back in. Swap it with chloride, right? Okay, this time I'm bringing bicarbonate in, chloride out, right? Okay, so now I've got those two, right? And I'm going to force it that direction. And if I have carbonic anhydrase, I will continue to force it to carbon dioxide and water, right? And split it into carbon dioxide and water. The fate of the water is who the hell cares. The fate of the carbon dioxide is now I have carbon dioxide inside the red blood cell. What do I do with it? Move it out into the plasma, across the basement membrane, into the alveolus, right? Good? Everybody good with that? Okay. So it's not super pleasant, but it is pretty logical, right? It's not a bad story as far as that. Okay, so in the lungs, the entire thing is reversed. So last thing is what determines, if this is a bidirectional, and it is, this can go both directions. What determines which direction the reaction goes? What determines which direction it shifts? It's PCO2, right? If PCO2 is high, like it would be at what capillary beds? Systemic capillary beds, it shifts the reaction to the right. If PCO2 is low, like it would be at what capillary beds? Pulmonary capillary beds, it shifts the reaction to the left. Good? That's the driving force of the whole thing. Everybody good with that? Okay, so increase in PCO2, by the way, is called hypercapnia, and a decrease in PCO2 is called hypocapnia. Okay, everybody good? All right, so how do you alter your PCO2? The primary way that you alter your PCO2 is by altering your rate of ventilation. Why do you not alter your rate of cellular respiration? Because you got shit to do, man. Right? So you do not say, my carbon dioxide is too high, so shut down my tissues, right? You say, my carbon dioxide is too high, so get to work, lungs, is what you say. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so here's the deal. Let's talk about what happens when you hyperventilate or hypoventilate. If you hyperventilate, and this people get conceptually confused on this, but not you. You guys are my smart class. Ready? If you hyperventilate, what you are going to do is primarily impact your concentration of carbon dioxide, and you're going to blow off excessive carbon dioxide, right? And what is that going to do to your pH? If you blow off too much carbon dioxide, it's going to bring it up, right? Okay, it will lower your H+ concentration. It will bring up your pH. So what does it cause? Respiratory acidosis or alkalosis? Respiratory alkalosis, right? Okay. Now, I've had students ask me, but doesn't the oxygen you take in actually balance that out? No, because that's not directly related. The oxygen you take in is oxygen for cellular respiration. Is cellular respiration instantaneous, first of all? No, it's not instantaneous. And second, do you do more cellular respiration just because you have more oxygen if you don't have higher metabolic needs? No. So it's not a direct relationship, right? Does that make sense? Okay. At least it's not an immediate relationship, right? Now, when you start hyperventilating, if you are hyperventilating but do not actually need to hyperventilate, it's like, of course you hyperventilate when you're working out, right? But if you hyperventilate and you don't need to hyperventilate, then it's going to cause respiratory alkalosis. And so what does your mom tell you to do? Breathe into a paper bag, not a plastic bag, because that's not going to last very long. You're going to run out of oxygen, right? Breathe into a paper bag because it's porous, right? And let oxygen in as well. And so what you're doing when you're breathing into a paper bag is instead of taking in just normal atmospheric concentrations of gases, which is relatively low in carbon dioxide, right? Then you're taking in a higher concentration of carbon dioxide, right? And what you're doing by taking in a higher concentration of carbon dioxide is you are doing what to your pH? You're lowering it, right, by breathing in more carbon dioxide, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's respiratory, and mom was always, like, as always, she's a little bit right, right? A little bit right. She usually isn't, like, completely right, because otherwise you'd never have to decide anything for yourself. Now, what about respiratory acidosis? Respiratory acidosis can be caused when you're not breathing up enough carbon dioxide, right? And that one is way harder to treat, okay? So with respiratory acidosis, if I had COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, anything that really caused problems with either getting air in and out or getting gases in and out, right? Which could be caused by a chronic emphysema or asthma or bronchitis or like lung cancer, anything that causes problems with like exchange of gases or moving stuff in and out. Then chronic obstructive pulmonary disease means that I'm building up too much carbon dioxide in my bloodstream, which of course is going to do what to my pH? Drop my pH, right? It's going to cause respiratory acidosis. Is that one easy to treat? No, it is not easy to treat. You either have to get them breathing better, right? You have to compensate with medication, or their kidneys have to compensate. Because your kidneys can, if your lungs don't, decide to pee out more H+, right? So although it doesn't initially sound intuitive, what is happening with your lungs can be really hard on your kidneys, right? Does that make sense? Do you see that little weird relationship? Okay, so respiratory acidosis is way harder to treat. Okay, so now we're going to do control of respiration. And so how you control your respiration. So the way that you control your respiration is not surprisingly with your nervous system, yes? And so your nervous system is going to tell the muscles when to contract, which will cause inspiration. And then when they relax, generally that is all you need to cause expiration, right? Okay, but let's talk about the places that this occurs. Okay, so do you guys remember the places in the brain that are responsible for controlling respiration? Do you remember? Medulla oblongata and the pons. Both. It's both. Yeah. Cardiovascular system is just medulla oblongata. Respiration is medulla oblongata and pons. So I don't expect you to memorize the names of these nuclei, but let me just show you. Okay. So if you were interested in such things, there is a small nucleus in the pons that's called respiratory, the PRG, the pontine respiratory group, and then there's two respiratory groups in the medulla oblongata. Okay, you don't have to know their names. Okay, they work together. Here's what happens. Those inspiratory neurons in the medulla oblongata and the pons are rhythmic. They send out a rhythmic action potential. Okay, and so they are inherently excitable and they have a rhythmic action potential. And the rhythmic action potential is going to go to your muscles of inspiration. So tell me, what are your muscles of inspiration? Diaphragm and external intercostal. So a little bit of anatomy ain't going to hurt anybody, right? In order to control your diaphragm from your medulla oblongata and your pons, you are going to send a stimulus through what nerve? Not big. Phrenic. Yeah, phrenic nerve. Good. Two phrenic nerves, right? You got phrenic nerves going to your diaphragm. In order to control your intercostal muscles, you are going to send that rhythmic, excitable impulse through what nerves? Intercostal nerves. Right? Remember your intercostal nerves, right? Okay. All right. So here's what happens. These are rhythmic. The somatic nervous system sends an action potential via the phrenic nerve and the intercostal nerves to the external intercostal muscles in the diaphragm. And they are going to contract, right? And when they contract, diaphragm moves down, intercostals move up, you increase the size of your thoracic cavity, which drops the pressure, and air moves in, right? So we know that. So the stimulus is going to go for about 2 seconds and then stop. And this is at rest, by the way. It changes when you're active, right? It's going to go for about 2 seconds and then stop. But then when it stops, that's all you need for exhalation, right? is to relax the external intercostal muscles and to relax the diaphragm, right? When that occurs, you're going to decrease the size of the container, increase the pressure. That is usually adequate for getting it above atmospheric pressure, and then air will move out, okay? So it's controlled by your nervous system. Now, controlled by your somatic nervous system, but it's rhythmic, and you are not actually controlling it voluntarily most of the time. So here's what's going on, is that the old unconscious involuntary portions of your brain, as pons and medulla oblongata, will run it at the same rate all the time. Can you change it with your cerebral cortex? Yep. Or I can talk, right? Okay. You can change it with your cerebral cortex until you piss off your brain. If you are not breathing enough so that the brain is happy with its pH and its carbon dioxide and its oxygen concentrations, it will make you sit down and it will take over. It's like, I trusted you once, now you sit down and I got this, right? Okay, so your expiratory neurons, when do those fire? Only when you decide to fire them. Just spit. When you decide to fire them. I want to be one of those spitty professors. Did I tell you about my spitty professor? Oh my gosh, I went into what? Oh yeah, oh my God, he was so spitty. So I went into, it was my first graduate class. I was super nervous, and I'm a total nerd about academics. So I was like front row right here, like right there, right? And all of the rest of the graduate students were at the back of the class. And I was like, what the hell's going on? Well, nobody sent me the memo that this guy flung sweat and spit for like 8 feet radius. And I was like drenched by the time that I left. I was like, screw you guys, thanks for telling me. So I didn't spit on you, I hope, this time. So expiratory neurons, they only fire during high levels of ventilation, and when they do, it's the intercostal nerves, but going to the internal intercostal muscles again and pulling them closer together. And of course, your abs can get involved too, but they're not directly related to inspiration. They're related to the whole process. Okay, so now let's talk about the inputs that control respiration rates. Okay, so we'll talk about, okay, so what kind of inputs are you using to decide on the output for respiration? Well, we know that your cerebral cortex has a little bit of influence, right? Your cerebral cortex can like decide to talk, which changes your rate of respiration. It can decide to hold your breath. It can do that, right? To a certain degree. So you can voluntarily speed up breathing or slow it down with your cerebral cortex. But then your limbic system, including your hypothalamus, if you get super duper emotional, scared, sad, whatever, it can increase your respiration rate too. Have you ever cried so hard that you could hardly breathe, right? Or seen kids do that, right? So that can also impact your respiration rate. So strong emotions. Pain can do it too. When you get into pain, you have this stress response, which will increase your respiration rate. It's not directly related to the sympathetic nervous system, because of course the sympathetic nervous system doesn't connect to skeletal muscle, but it would be occurring at the same time that your sympathetic nervous system was stimulated. Okay, so go ahead.
What about when you sigh? Is that voluntary or involuntary, or is it both?
Sighing.
To relax, instead of like relaxing?
Some
of those big old heavy sighs?
I don't know. I know yawns are relatively involuntary. I've never actually thought about sighs before. I'll think about that. Yawns are kind of interesting. They're usually because of low oxygen. And one of the indications that a person is socially connected is that if I yawn, and I yawn several times especially, you will probably yawn as well. It's that sort of social mirroring and empathy. It's one of the indications that you might be on the spectrum if you do not have that response, right? So if you yawn in front of someone who's pretty far into the spectrum, then their response to yawning is far less frequent, right? What? You're fighting. They also do the same thing with smiles and stuff like that with people who are on the spectrum. Go ahead.
People like yawn when they're tired, but I yawn all the time even if I get 12 hours of sleep. What's going on?
What is going on? I don't know. It might have to do with your hiccup thing too, right? Well, I mean, like she has like a little, is it a spasm that goes on? I wonder if the yawning thing has to do with that as well. That's interesting. Well, it's a little hard to lecture to people who are yawning all the time. So I'm mentally shooting you daggers, but okay, not you, Natalie. I love you, huh?
We'll just blame it on our
You blame it on night shift, and like I've had students say, I wouldn't be asleep if you were more engaging, and I was like,
No.
I'll throw this pen at you. That'll engage you. Okay. So now let's talk about the chemo. Okay, so you can use both conscious and subconscious portions of your nervous system to sort of decide how much to respire. But not surprisingly, you are also monitoring chemistry to decide how much to breathe, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So there are three chemicals that you could monitor. It's actually counterintuitive which one has the greatest impact on your breathing rate. You can monitor your PCO2, right? You can monitor your PO2, and you can monitor your pH. I would have initially thought that the thing that would have the greatest impact on breathing would be your PO2 in your bloodstream, and that doesn't, okay? Because it doesn't actually impact your pH. So the thing counterintuitively that has the greatest, fastest impact on your respiratory system when you're at rest, not when you're exercising, is your PCO2, and here's why. Okay, so here's the deal with your PCO2. PCO2 in the bloodstream, like concentration of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, right? Okay, so here's what happens. If your PCO2 increases, your carbon dioxide, you can't stop carbon dioxide from diffusing into your cerebrospinal fluid. Does that make sense to you? It does whatever the hell it wants. Okay, and if carbon dioxide diffuses into your cerebrospinal fluid, you will make it into H+, because that is what you do, right? Okay, and when you do that, you piss off your medulla oblongata, and the medulla oblongata says, I don't care what's going on, I don't care what the pH of your blood is, I don't care what your oxygen content is, I will actually cause you to breathe more, right? But this is not directly related to the pH of the bloodstream, because please note that H+ does not diffuse across the blood-brain barrier, right? Because those are continuous, complete tight junctions, and you are not going to diffuse ions on accident through. So it's really carbon dioxide concentration of the bloodstream impacts the pH of the cerebrospinal fluid, which impacts what we call our central chemoreceptors, because they're in the central nervous system, right? So the deal with carbon dioxide is your most powerful respiratory stimulant at rest. The increase of PCO2 causes diffusion into the cerebrospinal fluid, which will get made into acid in the cerebrospinal fluid, and the brain has almost zero buffering capacity, right? So it can't really protect itself from pH changes. So those central chemoreceptors respond to low pH, but not low pH in the bloodstream. Low pH in what fluid? Cerebrospinal fluid. They respond to low pH in the cerebrospinal fluid and cause you to breathe. Got it? Okay, now, so PCO2 is the most powerful respiratory stimulant at rest. The pH of the blood is second, okay? So the pH of the bloodstream, it doesn't diffuse directly in, so it's actually not going to affect the central chemoreceptors. Here is where it's going to affect. So this will come back together with stuff that we learned in the cardiovascular chapter, and that is, remember that you have chemoreceptors in the carotid, sinus, and the aortic arch, right? When we talked about them in the cardiovascular system, we said, oh, okay, you're monitoring oxygen, carbon dioxide, and H+ here and here to decide when to increase or decrease your cardiovascular system activity, right? That makes sense? But we're going to use now the same input to decide when to breathe more, right? So same chemoreceptors, same sensory input, still going through the medulla oblongata, but also going to the pons. Okay, good with that? And now what we are going to use is we are going to use the concentration of H+ here and here to decide whether we should breathe more. And specifically, this one is easier to piss off because where's that blood headed? To the brain, exactly. So what we are going to do is if we detect in those, these are called your peripheral chemoreceptors because they're not in your central nervous system, they're in the periphery, right? The central chemoreceptors was the ones in the medulla oblongata. Okay, these are in the periphery. So these peripheral chemoreceptors are going to respond to low blood pH, and what they are going to do is say, I don't care how you got the low pH, I'm going to breathe off more carbon dioxide to fix it. Is carbon dioxide the only reason you could have low blood pH? No, you could have had 6 Mountain Dews and have low blood pH. Your kidneys could not be functioning very well and you could have low blood pH. But your respiratory system is a one-trick pony for pH, right? It says whenever the pH is too low, I will do the thing I know how to do for pH, which is what? breathe off more carbon dioxide, right? So regardless of the reason you got low blood pH, if it is detected here especially, but also here, it will make you breathe more, right? Because it's trying to help. Got it? Okay, so, and then the last reason, the last respiratory stimulant is counterintuitively PO2. So even though it seems weird, your oxygen concentration in your bloodstream is not really used as an indicator of when to breathe more until it gets ridiculously low. It's usually like in the 90s in your bloodstream, 90 millimeters of mercury. It doesn't actually stimulate more respiration until it gets around 60 millimeters of mercury. And 60 is just like too little for the brain to be happy with. 60 is like, I can't do anything with 60 millimeters of mercury oxygen. So it has very little effect on breathing rate until it's very low. And when it is very low, it actually triggers breathing in the same places. Only when it gets to around 60, it will actually use that sensory input from the carotid sinus and the aortic arch to tell you to increase respiration. Okay, so let's do it one more time. Very first chemistry that can cause you to breathe more is what levels of what where? But where does that come from? High CO2 in blood plasma causing, say that again, the second part? Low pH in the CSF, right? Okay, that makes sense? That's the most powerful respiratory stimulant. That's not the same thing as saying that you have low pH in the bloodstream, okay? What is the next most powerful respiratory stimulant? What levels of what where? Go ahead. Yeah, the low pH in the bloodstream or a high H+ concentration in the bloodstream, right? That's the next one. And then what is the last one? What levels of what where? Low oxygen in the bloodstream. Yeah? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, it's not what I would have thought either, but that is how it works. And it's because you are less able to manage carbon dioxide concentration and pH than you are able to handle oxygen, because you can always stop your metabolism being really high if you, for instance, had low levels of oxygen. Go ahead.
So what happens when you get like this background from running? Why do you get that? Is that for breathing?
I don't know why that is. Do you know why that is? I've actually learned that before, but I don't remember. It does have something to do with your breathing, but I can't remember the details. And
to do with like being bent over, not in the proper position. You get it more when you're going downhill, so if you like stand up.
if you send me that question, I will figure out the answer to it. And I have before, I just forgot what it was. It's a good question. I just don't know a good answer for it. Okay, so respiratory system done. Okay? So now we are going to do urinary system. I love urinary system. I think it's really interesting. Really?
Why not?
You're just a nerd. You love it because you're a nerd, and I like that about you. Okay, so a urinary system is really interesting.
Takes the pressure right off.
It does, yes. But boom. Oh my goodness. My little boy learned puns. Did I tell you guys this? So the 11-year-old is in his language arts class. Part of what they had to do is they had to write puns. And he's like, this is the best day of class ever. And she's like, okay, so puns are like when you make a little word play and it's kind of like a dad joke. And he goes, I am literally going to be the best dad ever. I'm like, yes, you are. He was actually wearing a pun shirt at the time. It said pandemonium and it had a panda pushing over a table. And I was like, he's just like always. Okay, focus, Melanie. Here's the deal. Urinary system. If you don't remember the anatomy of the urinary system, you're going to have a little trouble with the physiology of the urinary system, okay? Primarily what you really need to remember is the structure of this critter. What is that called? The nephron, right? Okay, so I am going to assume that you understand the structure of the nephron. If you don't, please take the weekend to brush that up and make sure that you get it, okay? So really what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to remember that at nephrons, there are blood tubes next to P tubes, yeah? And because they are very close to one another and there's a lot of surface area, you have the opportunity for exchange between blood tubes and P tubes. remember that your nephrons occur primarily right at the junction of the cortex and the medulla and your kidneys. That's where they are, right? And you want your blood tubes next to your P tubes, but what you don't want is continuous flow between them, right? Because then you get pee in your blood. So what you want is you want them snuggled up close enough together and porous enough that you get exchange between them without actually connecting them to one another. So we will go over that a little bit, but I'm going to assume you know what the proximal convoluted tubule, the distal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, the collecting duct, that you know what all of that is, and the actual blood capillaries. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you know all of this, and we are going to start at Roman numeral 2. By the way, if I were you, I would, especially if I had any trouble remembering the anatomy, I would label all of this, make sure I knew it, and I would color code it. When you are dealing with P tubes, color the whole damn thing yellow, right? P yellow, right? And then color the blood tubes, you can color the whole damn thing red, even though, they do get deoxygenated at some point, so that you can keep track of them. The problem that most students have with the urinary system is they can't figure out when to stay in a blood tube and when to end up in a P tube. And so I'm going to try to help you guys with that as we go through there. Okay, so here's what we're going to do before we get into the specific physiology, is we're going to make sure that you guys get the terminology down. This is the only other thing that people have trouble with renal physiology, is you cannot use terms imprecisely. You have to use the term filtration when you mean filtration. Secretion is not the same thing as excretion. Reabsorption moves one direction, secretion moves the other. So you have to be really specific about terminology, because, for instance, you are actually going to move sodium, you're going to filter it out, and then you're going to reabsorb it. And if necessary, you could actually secrete it, right? And you have to know what the hell you're talking about when you use each term. So before we get into the details, we're going to do that thing that we did before, but we're going to add more to it. And so what we are going to say is, ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to have exchange between blood tubes and P tubes. But to make it really simple, and also because we know I can't draw, we're going to make the blood tube straight and the P tube straight. FYI, it's actually not called urine until you get into the collecting duct, but I'm fine with us calling it urine and knowing that it's filtrate until you get into the collecting duct. So what we're going to have in the nephron is we're going to have blood tubes next to P tubes. In order to increase transport between them, we will acknowledge that the vast majority of places they are actually pretty porous, right? Okay. And then what we are going to do is we are going to cleanse the blood by 3 different processes. And we're going to learn the names of the processes in just a second. First, let's add just a teeny bit of anatomy. Every single bit of blood coming from the kidneys would be coming from what artery? Coming to the kidney is coming from what artery? Whole kidney, renal artery. So ultimately, it's coming from the renal artery. There are a bunch of branches, right? Particularly concerned about the branches until you get to the afferent arteriole and phys, because the rest of it is just plumbing. Okay, and then of course everything that leaves the kidney is going to lead through what vein? Renal vein. What we will want to be able to do is to understand physiologically why and how the blood that is leaving the renal vein is different than the blood that's coming in the renal artery, and that's going to sort of be the understanding that we get today. Okay, so this is of course a circle ultimately, right? This is not a circle. This is a blind end tube. Which one is blind? Which end? Yeah, it starts here and it doesn't go back anywhere. It ends up in the toilet. Yes? Whatever gets dumped, that is called excretion. Not the same thing as secretion. Okay? All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to send the blood through, and we're going to do 3 different processes to it. Okay? And the first process is pressure driven, and it's called filtration. And since it's pressure driven, you guys know which of these fluids is always going to be higher pressure. Which one? Blood. Blood's always higher pressure because it's got a pump hooked up to it, right? So filtration pushes water in small solutes from high pressure to low pressure, so the direction of filtration is going to go that direction. Good? Okay, So let's talk about filtration just briefly. You guys remember that filtration is really not selective. It pushes anything that will fit through the holes with a whole bunch of water, right? So what kinds of things are going to be filtered out? So let's just look at what would be in the blood and what might be small enough to fit through the holes. Well, of course, you're going to move boatloads of water. You filter out 47 gallons of water per day, which means you're going to have a whole bunch of work with reabsorption, okay? So a whole bunch of water. What else is dependably small enough? How about ions? They're definitely going to move through, right? And they're water soluble. How about waste products like urea and uric acid? Those are water soluble and they're pretty small. They generally move. But what is water soluble and relatively small, like smaller than proteins, is nutrients. I didn't mean to move them across, but I'm not being selective. So nutrients like glucose and amino acids. Okay, so let me tell you guys my metaphor for understanding kidney function. What I want you to think about with kidney function is that with these three kidney functions, I want you to imagine that you have volunteered to help clean out your hoarder relative's trailer. Because we all know that we got a relative who lives in a trailer. Don't think we don't, okay? And we also got a hoarder relative. If you just look hard enough, you're going to find one, okay? And you are doing your public service to your family, and you have decided that you are going to clean the damn thing out. But when you walk into the trailer, it is so incredibly, it's just such a crap show, you don't even know where to start. So the first thing that you do is you decide, okay, first step, we're going to take everything that fits through the door, the holes, and we are going to dump it onto the dirt. And because they don't have a lawn, you know they don't, right? Okay, okay. It's hard for me to keep track of my lawn. So you're going to dump it onto the dirt in the front. And we're not going to be at all selective. So we are going to take out every cat box that we see the first time. We're going to take out 760 cans of corn because there was a sale at Walmart, right? We're going to take out the newspapers that go back to 1962, right? We're also going to dump grandma's china and a box of money onto the front lawn, okay? So we really just generally dumped everything that would fit through the door. What kinds of things don't fit through the door? Furniture, right? Whole red blood cells, huge proteins. They should stay in unless you bust the damn door open, right? But we're not going to do that, right? So what we are going to do is we're going to take everything out that fits through the door. Then the next steps are when you start being selective and start thinking about what you're doing, okay? So the next step is reabsorption, and this is selective. I am picking through the stuff in the front yard, right? And I'm deciding what is worth to bring back in. Does that make sense? Okay, so reabsorption is going to go which direction, guys? It's going to go back in. Okay, so let's think about what we are going to reabsorb. We dumped way too much water, so we always have to reabsorb water. We do not pee 47 gallons a day, although I have friends that it seems like they do. Okay, so you reabsorb water. Ions. Well, I reabsorb ions, but only as needed. I'm kind of selective as to how many ions I reabsorb. So this is like cans of corn, right? You dump 760 onto the lawn, but you might bring 10 back in, right? Because, you know, corn's corn, right? So, or with my kidneys, if I decided yesterday that I was going to eat an entire 1 pound bag of Doritos by myself, right? I got plenty of sodium in my bloodstream, right? So I'm going to push a whole bunch of sodium out. Do you think I really need to reabsorb any of it? No, right? What if I was doing one of those freaking lemon water fasts for 5 days and I push sodium out? Do you think I might need to reabsorb it? Yeah, I might need to reabsorb it. Does that make sense? So the ions are as needed. If you're calcium deficient, you do more calcium reabsorption. If you're potassium deficient, you do more potassium reabsorption. Good? Okay. And then what about waste products? Now, if the cat box and the 1962 papers made it out onto the lawn, you can leave them there, right? You don't reabsorb any waste products except for urea because it can help balance pH, but I won't make you memorize why you reabsorb urea. So for all practical purposes, you don't really reabsorb waste products. How about nutrients? How much of your glucose do you want to reabsorb? All of it, yes. So your nutrients, your glucose, and amino acids, but FYI, This is selective, and it is dependent on transport proteins like carriers that are subject to saturation. So sometimes they can get full. Filtration never gets full because it's general, right? But can reabsorption get full? Like if instead of eating a 1 pound bag of Doritos yesterday, you can tell what I'm fantasizing about, I ate a 1 pound bag of Oreos, right? And I'm going to end up with a whole bunch of glucose in my bloodstream, right? It's going to get pushed out. I'm going to try to bring it back in because it's money, right? But I can't because of the capacity of my carrier proteins, and I'm going to end up with sweet pea, right? But on a good day, you would be able to reabsorb almost all of your glucose. Does that make sense? Okay, so glucose and amino acids, you're going to bring those back in. Okay, so then what I did is brought some stuff back into the house, but now I need to do a careful look through the house, right? And Uncle Jim Bob needs my help. I'm going to look through all of his cabinets, look under the beds, find the shower that has 250 rolls of toilet paper in it, right? Because he hasn't showered in a long time, but he's got a lot of toilet paper, right? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a critical look at the house to decide what I didn't get the first time, but still needs to be dumped outside. Does that make sense? So this next step is secretion. And which direction is it going to move? Out. But it's selective. It's based on carriers and transport proteins. And what do you think you want to secrete? Do you want to secrete any glucose? No, you don't have a glucose secretion mechanism. How about excesses? If I had too much sodium still, okay, so I will secrete excesses. And what about that cat box that I found under the bed but I didn't find the first time? Yeah, I get rid of wastes as well. That makes sense to you guys? Okay, so which of these is a selective process? Which ones? Reabsorption and secretion. Filtration is not selective, right? Okay. Reabsorption and secretion are selective. So now can you see that the blood that is coming back in the renal vein is going to be different than the blood that's in the renal artery? It will, of course, be lower volume because you always lose water, right? But it's going to have a more homeostatic concentration of ions. It should have far fewer waste products, maybe even no waste products at all, right? Especially nitrogenous waste products. And then how about your concentration of glucose on a good day? Same, right? Should be the same as it goes through. Does that make sense? Okay, so by doing filtration, reabsorption, and secretion, you end up with what is excreted. So excretion is basically what ends up in the toilet, okay? So by doing all of these things, can you see that the kidneys are doing some subcategories of functions? The kidneys are regulating the osmolarity of the blood, the water concentration of the blood, by doing this. Can you see that? Because you can sort of decide how much water to keep versus dump. The kidneys are also regulating the ion composition of the blood. Can you see that? Yeah? Because they decide which ions to keep versus dump. And of course, by doing this, you are regulating your plasma volume and therefore your blood pressure, right? So your kidneys are intimately related to your blood pressure. Yes? Are very good? Okay. And then all I knew about the kidneys until I was in like college, honestly, was that they did this. Kidneys do a hell of a lot more than get rid of waste products, right? They're really intimately involved with your cardiovascular system. They remove metabolic waste products. All of your water-soluble wastes, if they're small enough, they get pushed out, right? And if they're waste products, do you generally have a reabsorption mechanism for them? No, you don't have like a transport protein for uric acid. You just push it out and then you leave it there, right? So urea, uric acid, and creatinine and some others, those get pushed out and then you just don't reabsorb most of them. Urea is the exception. And then you also remove foreign chemicals. So anything water-soluble that goes into your bloodstream, like a byproduct of drugs or food additives and those kinds of things. If they're small enough and water-soluble, they get pushed out, but we don't have a reabsorption mechanism, so they end up staying out there, right? That's only for water-soluble ones, right? So a lot of your water-soluble stuff gets pushed out of your kidneys. I didn't put this up here, but we will see that your kidneys are also, like we talked about before, going to be really responsible for regulating your blood pH, because one of the ions that they get to pick how much they reabsorb versus secrete is H+. So your kidneys and your lungs really collectively, they regulate your blood pH, right? Those two together. Okay, and we'll talk about it. I just didn't put it up in one of the functions. And then these things you actually know already, the two hormones that the kidney makes, but I'm going to ask you to put it together. The kidney makes renin in response to what? Low what? Blood pressure. And the kidney makes EPO in response to low oxygen. It's low oxygen because of low blood pressure or low red blood cells, right? That makes sense? Okay. So you knew those two. A couple other functions of the kidney that you may or may not know. The kidney also activates a form of vitamin D3. So vitamin D is made in your skin, but it's made in an active form, at least this one. It has to be activated by the kidney. So the only reason to say that is because now if you have kidney problems, you might have calcium problems. Okay. And then the other one, in a pinch, the kidney remembers how to do gluconeogenesis. It doesn't do anywhere near as much as the liver, but it can do a little bit of gluconeogenesis. Okay? All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go through filtration, reabsorption, and secretion and talk about mechanisms of controlling each. Okay, so filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. This is oversimplified, but filtration is basically going to be the first time that you get any exchange between the blood and the filtrate or the urine, right? And then from that filtrate, you can reabsorb and secrete. So we're going to do filtration first, okay? So what you end up excreting is basically what you filtered out minus what you reabsorbed plus what you secrete. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. So the first phase always has to be filtration because if you don't filter, do you have anything to reabsorb from? No, right? And you really don't have anything to secrete into because you don't really have a change in the concentration of the blood or the change in the urine. So filtration really has to be the first one. So let's talk about where anatomically filtration occurs. Filtration occurs here. It occurs from the glomerulus, which is this little ball of capillaries, into the capsule that surrounds the glomerulus. The site of filtration, both the glomerulus and the capsule, is called the renal corpuscle. So I'm going to show you this. People have trouble with it in both anatomy and physiology. So here's your renal corpuscle. Okay, so this whole thing collectively is the renal corpuscle. This is a capillary ball. It's got an arteriole going in and an arteriole going out. Everybody with me so far? Okay, so why the hell does this not look like typical capillary endothelium? It's because you're not actually seeing the capillary because this, so imagine this is my glomerulus, this is my ball of capillaries, everybody with me? Okay, and this is one of my arterioles. I don't have two arms, sorry, just imagine the other one, okay? So this is my glomerulus. So it should just look like a capillary. And it does, it's a fenestrated capillary, but what happens is it has a glove on because the capsule goes like this. Take this and push it into a softly blown up balloon, right? And you get a glove, right? Right? And then a space and then another layer, right? So what you're actually seeing is you're not seeing the capillary, you're seeing the inner layer of the capsule. And that matters because that means that everything that gets pushed out of the capillary goes directly through and then gets caught into the space of the capsule. Does that make sense? So note to self, you cannot use the word glomerulus and the word glomerular capsule interchangeably. Glomerulus in your head should be red because it contains blood. The glomerular capsule, also called Bowman's capsule, should be yellow because it contains filtrate, P. Got it? Okay, so you can't use those interchangeably. People do it in anatomy and in physiology, but they are different structures, okay? One of them's the pitcher and the other one's the catcher, okay? All right, so glomerular filtration happens at the glomerulus. So before we go any further, glomerular filtration is going to push stuff from what fluid to what fluid? Glomerular filtration is going to push stuff from what fluid into what fluid? Blood into filtrate or urine. Yes, exactly. Okay, so you guys already know this, and filtration is not going to be super hard for you because you understand pressure pretty damn well, which is why we never do urinary system before we do cardiovascular system because you can't freaking do it, right? Okay, so filtration is basically going to be dependent on pressure, right? Because that is what filtration is going to be. And specifically, it's going to be dependent on blood pressure. So what's your prediction? If you increase systemic blood pressure, what is your prediction about what will generally happen to your filtration rate? It's going to increase. And if you decrease systemic blood pressure, your filtration rate is going to decrease. There are a couple of little weird exceptions to that, but mostly that's going to be your expectation, which is good because it means that we don't have to go back and say, okay, how do we increase filtration rate? Every single way that you increase blood pressure is how you do it, right? With one little weird exception. So substances are basically going to, let's say we are following sodium ion, right? Doesn't matter what you follow, as long as it's not a red blood cell, so that should stay behind, or a large protein that should stay behind. Substances are going to pass through here. So let's look at this structure. So here is the inner layer of the capillary, the glomerulus, right? And then here is the inner layer of the capsule, right? Substances are going to pass through. The capillary is fenestrated, so it's going to be better at transport. The inner layer of the capsule has what we call filtration slits made by these weird cells called podocytes. Anyway, it's really, really porous, right? And you are going to pass that sodium ion from the blood plasma into the space of the capsule, right? And then what's going to happen to it if it stays in the capsule? It's going to go through the proximal convoluted tubule and maybe end up in the toilet, right? So that's the sodium ion that we're following right now. So filtration is dependent on pressure. And so I want to talk about why your kidneys are so very good at filtration. So all capillaries do filtration, guys, because they're all higher pressure than the interstitial fluid around them, and you're always going to lose a little fluid as you go through capillaries. But collectively, all of the other capillaries in your body filter out about 1 gallon of filtrate per day, 1 gallon of blood plasma into the interstitial fluid, and your kidneys collectively filter out 47 gallons per day. So questions, why are they so good at filtration compared to all of the rest of the capillaries collectively? And the answer is basically 3 things. First, you have 1 million nephrons per kidney. That's a lot of surface area, right? Second, they are incredibly porous. So they are basically really set up for filtration because of how porous they are, right? And then third, and this one's the really interesting one, I'll show you a different picture from your anatomy textbook because it shows it better. Please note that there's an afferent arteriole going in and an efferent arteriole going out. Look at the difference in diameter of the afferent and the efferent arteriole. If you've got a big tube going in and a small tube coming out, what happens to the pressure in here? It goes up. And it goes up at every single one of those 1 million glomeruli. Does that make sense? Okay. So they're really, really good at filtration because of the anatomy and the surface area, right, of these guys. Does that make sense? Okay. So the amount of filtrate that is flowing out of all of the renal corpuscles, do you know, did I mention that term yet? Okay. So people have trouble with this, but the pitcher and the catcher together, the glomerulus plus the capsule, is called the renal corpuscle, right? That thing, that site of filtration, both the pitcher and the catcher, is called the renal corpuscle. So the amount of filtrate that is moving out of all of the renal corpuscles in both kidneys every single minute is called the glomerular filtration rate, the GFR, glomerular filtration rate. What is your glomerular filtration rate? About 47 gallons or 180-ish liters. I'm an American, so you know I can't do liters. So 47 gallons per day. Per minute, about 125 mils, about that much per minute. So can you see that if you didn't do reabsorption, you would lose almost your entire blood volume within a matter of about 5 to 7 minutes from your kidneys. So you filter out a ton and you reabsorb a ton, okay? So collectively, all of the rest of the capillaries, 1 gallon per day. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about now. We're going to talk about factors that are impacting GFR, what increases or decreases your GFR. But mostly it's going to be relatively easy because with a few exceptions, if you increase your systemic blood pressure, you'll increase GFR, and if you decrease systemic blood pressure, you'll decrease GFR. But there's a couple of little tweaks to that, okay? So first thing is I want to talk about intrinsic control of GFR, which means we will be talking about paracrine agents and stuff that doesn't affect the entire body, but it's just local. It's not going to be super robust or super strong, right? Talk about intrinsic regulation of GFR, and then we'll talk about extrinsic regulation of GFR. Extrinsic regulation of GFR is going to be primarily just regulating your systemic blood pressure will regulate your GFR, okay? Okay, so intrinsic first. And with this one, you have to pay attention because you'll get the logic really quickly if you pay attention and you'll miss it if you don't. Okay, so the first one is, okay, afferent arteriole leads in. Let's look at this one. Afferent arteriole leads in, efferent arteriole leads out. Everybody's got that, right? Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to have some little control mechanism that allows my GFR to not change with, for instance, small changes in activity like when I walk to the car, because my blood pressure will go up when I walk to the car, right? Do I want the GFR to go up when I walk to the car? No. When I lay down or sleep for 8 hours, I don't remember the last time that happened, but when let's say I sleep for 8 hours, do I really want to stop filtering my blood because my blood pressure went down? No, I do not. So what can I do to maintain a relatively constant GFR despite changes in activity or body position? Okay, so here's the deal. What I am going to do is I am going to manipulate the size of my what? Afferent or efferent arteriole? What makes more sense to you? Afferent. It's afferent because it's how much blood is going in. So here's the deal. If I, for instance, lay down, but I want my GFR to stay relatively constant, what should I do to my afferent arteriole? Dilate it. Send more blood in. Yes? Not dilate the efferent arteriole. Just dilate the afferent, right? What if when I walk to my car, I do not want my GFR to go up despite the fact that my blood pressure goes up a little bit? What can I do to my afferent arteriole? Constrict it, right? Does that make sense? So this is myogenic regulation. You've seen myogenic regulation in other places. This myogenic regulation is specifically trying to maintain a relatively constant GFR despite maybe changes in body position. Does that make sense to you? Now you can manipulate the efferent arteriole as well, but doesn't it have a more dramatic impact on filtration if you manipulate what's going in than what's going out? Right? So you can do both, but the afferent arteriole is really the powerful one. So let's make sure that makes sense to you. So as systemic blood pressure increases, but I want to keep my GFR constant, one more time. What do I do to my afferent arteriole? Constrict. Yes? As systemic blood pressure decreases, like I'm laying down, but I want to keep my GFR constant, what do I do to my afferent arteriole? Dilate. Got it? Okay. All right. So next one is, oh, everybody hates this. We're going to do it anyway. Okay. I know you've learned it before, but I know you're going to try to pretend like you haven't because everybody does. Juxtaglomerular apparatus? Anyone? Okay, so I want to remind you of, do you remember at all that the distal convoluted tubule in most nephrons runs right by the afferent arteriole? It's not connected to it, it's just close to it. So the distal convoluted tubule will, on its way out, run right by the afferent arteriole. Okay, that location is called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. It has hormonal impacts, but we're going to talk about its paracrine impacts first. Ready? Okay, here we go. Juxtaglomerular apparatus. There are cells that are in the wall of the distal convoluted tubule, and here's what they do. So just stick with me, you'll get it. This is just paracrine. It's not very powerful, but what happens is when these cells in the wall of the distal convoluted tubule, they're called macula densa cells, when they detect a whole bunch of flow going by them, what they say is, we got plenty of pee. And then they communicate to the afferent arteriole and tell it to do what? Constrict. You got it? Yes, exactly. That makes sense? It's just this little control mechanism that says, cool it on the pee, please, right? We're a little busy here. And it causes constriction of the afferent arteriole. Got it? Okay, so it's not very powerful. It can't really handle massive changes, but it will just say, you can slow down, we got to catch up, right? Okay, that's called, big long word that totally makes sense if you let it, tubuloglomerular feedback. Tubuloglomerular feedback, right? In the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Say those words to the people who think that you're not getting your money out of physiology. Well, do you know about the tubuloglomerular feedback in the juxtaglomerular apparatus? I didn't think so. Shut your pie hole. Okay. All right, so now, next thing we are going to talk about is extrinsic regulation of GFR. Extrinsic regulation of GFR is primarily nervous and endocrine, and we're going to add in the endocrine a little bit later after we really get together the whole story. Okay, so the deal is that with nervous and endocrine system, with one exception, If you increase systemic blood pressure, you're going to increase GFR, and if you decrease systemic blood pressure, you're going to decrease GFR by almost any mechanism. If you increase systemic blood pressure by the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, you're going to end up increasing GFR. If you decrease it, you're going to decrease GFR. Okay, so that's going to be the expectation, which means that we don't necessarily need to go through every single factor that can cause you to increase blood pressure. MAP is mean arterial blood pressure, because pretty much the expectation is if you increase mean arterial pressure, you'll increase GFR. If you decrease mean arterial pressure, you'll decrease GFR. One exception, though. And the one exception is kind of like initially counterintuitive, but I think it makes sense to me. And that is that if you have mild sympathetic activity, right? Mild sympathetic activity, like, oh, tiger walks in the room, and you're like, oh, it's over there, it's a baby tiger, it's fine. Okay? Mild sympathetic activity, what it does is it actually slightly decreases GFR because while it is vasoconstricting everywhere, it also vasoconstricts the afferent and the efferent arterioles, right? And so it actually decreases GFR. And the way that this makes sense to me, although I have no idea if this is the logic that actually works, but it works to understand it, is if a freaking tiger's in the room, do you really want to have to pee? You got shit to do. You got tigers to deal with, right? Right? So what happens is with mild sympathetic activity, or when you're exercising, do you really want to have to pee? Like if you are forcing yourself to do 30 minutes on the stupid climber, I'm not up to 30 minutes yet. If you're forcing yourself to do 30 minutes on the climber, do you want to have to pee in the middle of it? Because if you have to go pee, are you going to get back on that climber? Hell no, you don't want to get on in the first place, right? Mild sympathetic activity decreases GFR because it shuts down the afferent and the efferent arteriole a little bit. Good? Okay. No time for peeing when there's tigers around. All right. So now, blood pressure affects GFR. Any nervous or endocrine change that affects blood pressure affects GFR in the way that you would expect it to, except sympathetic stimulation. That one's weird. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about shock. And, okay, so we didn't talk about shock before because we didn't do that last patho portion of the cardiovascular notes, but now we have time to do it, so let's talk about it a little bit. Here's what shock is. Circulatory system shock means specific, something specific. It means that your blood pressure is too low to deliver adequate blood flow to capillary beds. Yes? Yes? Circulatory system shock means your pressure is dropped too low. Why the hell could it have done that? I don't know. I had a heart attack. I hemorrhaged. I have massive vasodilation because of an allergic response. Regardless of the reason, your blood pressure really, really dropped, right? You with me? Okay, so I want to talk about what circulatory system shock would do to kidneys. What do you think it would do to kidneys? If you go into circulatory system shock, what can you expect from your kidney function? Yeah, your kidneys can and do shut down on you if you stay in shock for any length of time. So what happens is circulatory system shock. If your mean arterial pressure goes below about 45 millimeters of mercury, it shuts down filtration because there's not enough pressure difference between the filtrate and the blood. That makes sense? And so you're not going to get any filtration. And that causes renal suppression, which will result in anuria, which means I'm not producing any pee. You don't produce anything, you're not going to have anything to reabsorb from. That is going to be very bad very quickly because, of course, you're going to have waste products and pH problems building up in your bloodstream if your kidneys shut down. Yes? Okay, so let's talk about what would happen in that situation. Okay, so if I had a person who was going into shock and did not have kidney problems, I'd give them epi. But if I had a person who was going into shock and they had kidney problems, do you give them epi? No, because what would it do? It shuts down their afferent and their efferent arterioles, and it causes more problems with renal suppression. So the best you can do in that situation that I know of, there's probably better treatments now, but the one that makes physiological sense now is to give them dopamine, because dopamine will increase your blood pressure. It causes vasoconstriction. It doesn't actually have any stroke volume effect on the heart, though, so it's not as good at recovering from shock, but it actually retains your kidney function, right? It doesn't have any receptors on the afferent and the efferent arteriole. So it bumps up your pressure without sacrificing kidney function. Does that make sense to you? So with that situation, you can give dopamine instead of epi. Now, you might still die, but you might get to keep your kidney function. Okay, so everybody good with that? So you got GFR. We'll come back to GFR just a little bit when we start talking about hormonal regulation of all of this, but not too much. Okay, so questions. Everybody okay with GFR? GFR, the only exception to GFR is really sympathetic nervous system, right? That's the only weird part about it. Okay, so the second phase is going to be called tubular reabsorption. Tubular reabsorption. Okay, so here we are going to be in this part of the story. Tubular reabsorption happens from the renal tubule into the bloodstream, okay? And I'm going to tell you that tubular reabsorption happens in two distinct steps. You ready? We are going to have reabsorption that occurs here, proximal convoluted tubule to peritubular capillaries, right? That is what we're going to call obligatory reabsorption, or my students told me that they didn't know what obligatory meant, so unregulated reabsorption. You can't do a damn thing about it. You just reabsorb here based on the number of transport proteins you have, okay? You with me? Okay, and then you have a second shot at reabsorption, and that occurs in the loop, the nephron loop or the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule primarily. And that is called facultative reabsorption or regulated reabsorption. And this one can be regulated especially by hormones that you've met before, like ADH, like ANP, like aldosterone. Hormones that you've met before, right? So they can't do a damn thing to the proximal convoluted tubule, but they can regulate, if necessary, what's happening at the distal convoluted tubule, okay? All right, so reabsorption, before we go any further, reabsorption moves substances from what fluid into what fluid? From the blood back, the filtrate back into the bloodstream, yes? Okay, now what anatomical structure back to what anatomical structure? You could do it. So moving it back from the proximal convoluted, from the tubule, right? Proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, and distal convoluted tubule, back into the peritubular capillaries and vasorecta. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Okay. All right, so now, how much reabsorption are you going to do? A hell of a lot of reabsorption because you don't pee anywhere near 47 gallons per day, right? So let's look. You do not have to memorize this table. I just want to show you this table that shows you what you reabsorb. So here's how much water you filter out per day, 180 liters, right? Think of a 90 2-liter Coke bottles. That's a hell of a lot of filtration. But how much do you reabsorb? Usually almost all of that. You usually pee out about 1 liter to 1.5 liters per day, depending on what you drink and how much you drink, right? So notice that your percentage is reabsorbed at about 99%, 99.2%. Okay, how much on a good day of the glucose that you filter out do you reabsorb? On a good day, 100%. On the day after Halloween, you'll do what you can, right? If you are a diabetic who's not treated really well, you're going to actually end up peeing some glucose out, right? Because your reabsorption mechanism is limited by saturation, but your filtration mechanism is not limited by saturation. Got it? Okay, urea, this one's a little counterintuitive to people. You actually do reabsorb about 50% of your urea because it helps maintain your blood pH. But look at everything else. Reabsorb about 99% of your sodium. It depends on how much you've eaten, but generally speaking, you have a little trouble with reabsorption of potassium. So you're far more likely to be potassium deficient than you are sodium deficient for reasons we'll talk about. And look at the other ones. So reabsorption is incredibly, incredibly active, and you can control it. You can control distal convoluted tubule reabsorption. Okay, so here's the deal. Reabsorption is determined really by, do you remember learning that your freaking kidneys tubules are made of simple cuboidal epithelium? Look at that, right? Didn't have any relevance to you whatsoever when you learned it at the beginning of anatomy. You're like, I don't even know what a kidney tubule is, so I don't know, I'm going to memorize this, so I'm going to recognize those little cells, right? So now what I'm telling you is these simple cuboidal epithelial cells are going to get to control what is reabsorbed because by the kind of transport proteins they have on them. Okay, so here's the deal. How are you going to move things back across? We're going to go back all the way back to the beginning of the semester and say you are going to move it by the cheapest, fastest way first. So if you can diffuse it, you will, right? If you can't diffuse it, you will do facilitated diffusion, right? Before that, you would actually use a channel, and then you would do facilitated diffusion. And then if you had to pay for it, you would pay for it. And then what's cheaper, secondary active transport or primary active transport? Secondary is cheaper, right, than primary, right? So this is just going to be an application of closing the circle of the entire semester, is that you are going to be able to predict how things are going to move across based on things you learned ages ago. I know it feels like ages, doesn't it? Okay, so what's going to happen is you are going to move things through, right? Let's just get you a general picture. Okay, we are going to move things from the lumen of the tubule, wherever it is, proximal or distal convoluted tubule, and we're going to move it into the capillary. And what we are going to have to do is that transepithelial transport that we talked about before. You're going to have to move it across the apical surface, through the cell, across the basal surface. This peritubular space is not a tissue. It's just a little bit of space, a little bit of basement membrane in there, a little bit of interstitial fluid. And then you're going to reabsorb it back into the capillary. In certain places, the capillaries are fenestrated. In certain places, they aren't. Everybody okay with that? So it's a general thing that we're actually going to do here. And so how are you going to do reabsorption? Passive if you can, active if you must. Secondary active before primary active, right? Okay. So the last thing that I want to do today is just to teach you guys about glucose reabsorption, and I'll start with it on Tuesday as well because we've got plenty of time to finish the material. Okay, so how do you predict that I would get glucose back in as cheap as I possibly could? Yeah, so what I'm actually going to end up doing is I am going to move it back in by secondary active transport because I was already going to move a whole bunch of sodium back in anyway, right? Does that make sense? And how much of it do I want in the bloodstream, the glucose? All of it, even if I already had a high concentration in the bloodstream and a low concentration in the filtrate. You guys with me? If I continue to want to accumulate it and I don't want to pay for it directly, then secondary active transport is going to use sodium's concentration gradient to move it back in instead of having to depend on glucose's concentration gradient. Does that make sense to you? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do secondary active transport, last thing, and then I'll let you guys go. What kind of transport protein is that? Carrier protein, right? Moving it, right? And then what kind of transport protein is that going to be? That's a carrier too, yes, because of glucose's size. And it's going to move it out by facilitated diffusion, diffuse it in through fenestrated capillaries. The only thing I have to worry about is keeping my sodium-potassium concentration gradient okay. And the sodium-potassium pump is going to take care of that. Here's the deal though. This is subject to saturation. And when it gets saturated, your reabsorption mechanism is going to be limited. So after I ate that 1 pound bag of Oreos, right? I am going to end up with a whole bunch of glucose in my filtrate. I'm going to do my damnedest to get it reabsorbed. And then I'm going to end up peeing out some of it anyway because there was too much to reabsorb while I was going through the tube, right? Same thing with a diabetic. So with a diabetic, what is going to happen is if the blood glucose is high, then the filtrate glucose is high and you can't reabsorb it all. The excess is going to remain in the tube, in the urine. And it's going to cause glycosuria. And last thing, and then I'll let you guys go. Who wants to tell me why excess glucose in the tube as it goes through, right, is going to end up making you pee more? Who remembers? Who remembers? Excess glucose in the tube as it goes through is going to make you pee more. It's just osmosis, right? Remember that if you have a whole bunch of a non-penetrating solute that can't actually diffuse, it's going to exert an osmotic effect as it goes through the tube and suck water in and suck water in and suck water in, and diabetics pee a lot. That's the whole story right there. That make sense? Because you didn't actually reabsorb it. So if you go on a bender, you probably wouldn't notice. If you go on a sugar bender on Halloween, you're going to pee more the next day, but you don't care. Doesn't make any difference because you got candy. You're fine. Okay. So here's the plan for